Thanks for joining us and the followers up the way. I want to chat with us this evening. There's no way we're going to get through all the material that I have, so I'm going to cut it into smaller pieces. And I'll give you the reference material and you can look it up at your leisure. We're going to talk tonight about Peter. Now, Peter's one of my favorite guys because Peter just didn't always get it right. And that kind of gives me hope because, he was a pretty famous guy and pretty important in the Christian spirituality, and he didn't always do the right thing. And yet he had some wonderful things to say and wonderful things to do. I want to start with just talking about Peter the man. He started out as a fisherman. And the story I want us to focus on tonight is the story of Peter walking on the water. Do you remember that one? So I'm going to give you the references here. We're going to focus in Matthew 14:24 through 33. At the same time, it's in. Let me just get there. 24 through 33. And you can find the same story in Mark 6, chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Mark 6, 45 through 52, the similar story. In Luke, it doesn't really have the same story, but it does have a reference of Simon Peter having a mother-in-law. And I want to give you that reference, Luke 4:38. So he was a married man. You have to be married in order to have a mother-in-law. And also the same story in John 6, 16 through 24, the walking on the water. Actually, that one doesn't show the walking on the water. It just has that event, but leaves out his walking on the water. So let's look at this Matthew 14, 24 through 33. So it's in the New Testament. First chapter in the New Testament is Matthew. Are we there? Who would like to read? Should we read a verse around? Let's do. You want to start, Trace? I guess I should get closer with the microphone. Want the other microphone? Matthew 14, 24 through 33.
But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary.
Have you got it, Sandra?
What are we doing now?
25, 14, 25.
And the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. Is that right?
Yes. William, 26. Oh, Bill's got it.
When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear.
But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage. It is I who do not be afraid."
Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water."
Sorry, I have to pass. Yeah, so the microphone's not working.
And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus.
But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me."
Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?"
Which one?
32.
32. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped.
And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's son."
Wonderful. All right, thank you. So let's look at this for just a minute. There's other things I want to share with you about that. I find it interesting that they thought it was a ghost. I mean, I would have thought it was something walking on the water. That would totally freak me out. And this fourth watch is about from 3 to 6 a.m. So it may have been at the beginning of daylight. We get daylight here before 6. But between 3 and 6, it can be really dark. And if you've been battered around by the waves and things like that, I mean, this would be a really frightening experience. But here's Peter, good old Peter. What a character. Instead of just being, okay, come on, Jesus, let me come out there with you. I want to do it. You know, he was just, if you're doing it, I can do it too. Let me do it too. Let me try. Don't you just love that? I just love that about him. And then he stepped out, and then he realized, what am I doing? All the wind and the waves, and freaked himself out. And what happened? Started to sink. And all it took was him asking for help. He had to ask for help. Jesus helped him. And they both got into the boat. And in John, the story says that the boat immediately was at the other side. So when you read that, take a look at that. How that immediately, it was no longer in the middle of the lake. It was already on the other side. So let's look a little bit more at Peter. Let's stay in the book of Matthew, and I'd like us to move to Matthew 16, verses 13 through 18. Matthew 16, verses 13 through 18. You want to read that?
Sure. And when Jesus came into the district of
Matthew 16? Yes, you're right. I'm sorry, I was on the wrong verse. Go right ahead.
Now when Jesus came into the district of
Caesarea, I believe.
Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they say, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it."
Okay, meaty stuff. Meaty stuff. So here's bold Peter again. Let me not blast your eardrums out. And everybody else is saying, well, you're one of the prophets, or you're John the Baptist, or Elijah. And this was because many of the Jewish people believed in reincarnation. The Sadducees believed in reincarnation. The Pharisees did not, if I get that correctly. But here, this wasn't something that was logical, but it was something that he had perceived. He had just walked on water, just 2 chapters earlier. So he got it, he figured it out, he recognized the truth of that. It wasn't quite enough for Peter. Wasn't quite enough for Peter. Bless his little soul. Thank God for Peter. Let's now look at Peter. And you know, well, before we do that, I want to look at something else. Peter had this character that he wanted to just try. He wanted to jump in there and get it done. He wanted to be a participant. And I really like that about him. But Peter had a flaw. And let's look at that flaw. We're going to go to the book of Luke. So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, chapter 22, verses 54 through 62. Luke 22. Luke 22, verses 54 through 62. Long chapters. And this is when Jesus was taken in for trial. And so let's read verse around, shall we? You want to start, Tracy? Read loud.
Having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance.
And after they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting among them.
And a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight, and looking intently at him, said, "This man was with him too."
57. Luke 22.
But he denied it, saying, Woman, I do not know him.
A little later, another saw him and said, You are one of them too. But Peter said, Man, I am not.
Trudy, 59.
After about an hour.
Oh, Mary's got it.
Oh, yeah.
No cat, no cat.
Yeah,
The cat moved.
After about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, Certainly this man was also was with him, for he is a Galilean too.
Trudy, 60.
But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are talking about. Immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed.
The Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.
And he went out and wept bitterly.
So let's look a bit at that. Here's the sad thing. Peter just wanted to he was a bit of a people pleaser. Well, would you blame him? I mean, here's a guy that's being accused and tried and had done absolutely nothing wrong. And oh, you're one of them? Oh my gosh, wouldn't I have done the same thing? I wouldn't have had the courage to say, yes, take me and try me too. No, I think I would have denied the whole thing as well. That self-preservation is really strong. I can't judge him about that. And I think if we move further into the New Testament, we'll see how that same people-pleasing need comes up again for Peter. So let's look in Galatians, just before Ephesians. Right after Corinthians. We're going to look at Galatians 2, 7 through 14. And this is Paul now talking. And we read the verse where Peter was Peter. He was also known as Cephas, and Peter is the word that means stone or pebble. Remember that where Jesus said, "This is the stone upon which I build my church." Did we read that? I don't think we read that, did we? Pardon me. So he had Cephas and Peter were both of his names. So with that in mind, would you start with verse 7? Let's start with verse 6.
But from those who were high reputation, what they were making no difference to me. God shows no
partiality.
Partiality, thank you. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me.
But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised.
All right, so let me describe what that is. Jewish people follow the tradition of circumcision, and people that did not were Gentiles. And that was the beginning, or the base difference between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person. And that was a big bone of contention of being Jewish. That was the first rule that they ever had to follow as a Jewish male. And then all the rest of the rules added to that. So that was a big deal for them. So go ahead.
For he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectively worked for me also to the Gentiles.
Okay, so in other words, God worked for both of them. You know, Paul, who was the one who was Saul, and went around and was capturing Christians, because Paul was a Pharisee, very high up in the order, and he was capturing Christians and putting them to death because they were following this way, and he thought it was so wrong. And then he had his conversion process, and he realized that, oh my gosh, you know, I need to change my ways. And so rather than going to the Jewish people, which you would think would be a real good thing because he has all that Jewish background and knowledge, instead of leaving that to a common fisherman. But that's the way it worked out, that Peter, who was this common fisherman with his exuberance, he was a powerful person. And he was best suited for reaching the Jewish people. And Paul was best suited for reaching the people that were non-Jewish, that were looking towards the salvation, or towards a new spiritual path. So go ahead. Verse 9.
And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised.
They only ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do.
You didn't want William to read? That's okay.
But when it came to Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned.
Okay, so Cephas, the same thing as Peter. And Paul got in his face about it. And what did he get in his face about that?
12.
Verse 12.
For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision.
Verse 13.
The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy.
But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?
So we'll just stop there. So here, I just wanted you to get a grip or a glimpse of here's Peter again, worrying about what other people are going to think, worrying about other people's condemnation, or worrying about other people's expectations. We all get caught up in that. Now here's a really cool thing. Peter himself wrote a couple of books, and there's some fascinating information in there. So let's go to 1st and 2nd Peter. So keep going. It's past Galatians. Yes. Paul, the Apostle Paul.
So where do you get?
Peter and Cephas are the same name. Peter and Cephas are the same name. So 1st and 2nd Peter. Unless you lose it like I just did. There it is.
Did you say 1st
First Peter. We're gonna scan 1st and 2nd Peter because there's some really cool stuff in here. So knowing Peter's come from and knowing his weakness, here's some things that he had to say. Gosh, where to point you to? Look at chapter 2. There's a ton of stuff. If you get a chance to read 1st and 2nd Peter back to back in your own leisure, it's just a phenomenal read. Chapter 2. Who's got the microphone? Okay. Dan, read the first 3 verses there, would you?
Therefore, putting aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord.
And now verse 4, 5, and 6. Would you read that?
And coming to him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ.
Go ahead and read verse 6, please.
Okay. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed.
Okay, so back in Matthew, we discovered Jesus said, Peter, you're the stone, you're the pebble. But the stone, the foundation is the Christ, is the Christ consciousness, that salvation, that is our birthright, is our destiny, what we have a right to achieve. And so Peter, who was in the space and had Jesus tell him, you're the pebble, is now saying, Jesus is the rock. Jesus is the cornerstone. I think that's beautiful. Let's skip down to verse 9 and read verse 9. Just verse 9 by itself. That should be enough.
But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possessions, so that you may proclaim the excellences of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
Wonderful. Now skip down to verse 17. Would you read 17? Thank you.
Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king.
All right, so here he is. Honor one another. Love one another. You know, he's got it. He finally got it. Now glance into verse 24. Oh, did it go off? There we go. That's probably a wise.
And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed.
And then in chapter 3, he talks about wives and husbands. Now look in chapter 3. This is really cool. Let's read verses 18 and 19. Would you do that? This is fun stuff.
For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison.
Now hold that thought. Now go down to chapter 4, verse 6.
For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the Spirit according to the will of God.
I have no idea what that means. But how cool is that? You know, Peter had some deep thinking. He had really spiritually matured. And that's great news for all of us. That's great news for all of us. Chapter 5, verse 7. Oh, 6 and 7. Read 6 and 7.
Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon him, because he cares for you.
How cool is that? And here's Peter. He was the one that didn't humble himself, pulled away from people that, because he was afraid of these other people and what they might think about him. He couldn't associate with those guys. And now he's talking about humility. He got it. How cool is that? And the last one I want to, let's move into 2 Peter. Oh, there's so much here. 2 Peter, 1st chapter, verse 19. I love the symbolism in this.
2 Peter what?
1st chapter, verse 19.
So we have the prophetic word made sure, for which you do well to pay attention as to a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your hearts.
Isn't that beautiful? That's beautiful, deep stuff. This is a rich expression of our spirituality, and Peter got it. Peter got it. And glance.
Isn't Christ referred to as the morning star?
Yes, the bright and morning star. Well, that's a song that we sing. Yes. But I think, let me look at the reference here. Verse 19. It's Psalms 119, 105. So if somebody wants to go to Psalms 119, 105, let's just look. 119, verse 105. Psalms 119.
Do we know where Psalms is?
Old Testament. There should be a little marker. And verse 105. It doesn't refer to it as the morning star. It says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." Yep. So this is a Peter's phrase. But isn't it beautiful? The day dawns and the morning star arises in your heart. I just love that. That is so beautiful. And then last time we talked about with the day, 1 day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is 1 day. And that is in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8. Who would read that again for us? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8.
But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that the Lord one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day.
And the point he's making here, he talks about the creation, verse 5. The earth was formed out of water and by water. And he's talking about the promises of God. And even though it's that universal now, have you ever had spiritual connection and it's like, oh, it's happening now. And then it happens like 2 years later or something. The spiritual now is different than our perception of now. So this is letting us know that promises are coming. And don't worry about when. Don't worry about when. It's in the right timing. Things happen in the right timing.